wanted to talk about democracy today because it's a lot different than I think what people thought it was even 5 years ago with all the wars and stuff. But I saw a quote from a, a federal judge from the 1930s who described democracy as a process, not a static condition. It's becoming rather than being. It can be easily lost, but it can never is fully won. Its essence is an eternal struggle, and I think we're in the eternal struggle part right now, trying to figure out how the world is going to move, given the fact that the U.S., which has been the world leader and is the world's reserve currency and largest economy and was the biggest military, now has a very formidable rival in China with a very different ideology driving it. And I think there are kind of two big battles being fought aside from the obvious conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, but you have the battle between the autocrats and the democratic nations around the world, but also inside each of those nations, there is a battle for the share of mind as to what is the right model to go forward in the world we're living in today. And I think you're seeing that in some of the policies of China, where they're trying to figure out, do we go for stability versus growth right now? It's about how does our model fit, and do we get where we want to get to as a nation versus how do we do that against the U.S., given that we're in a battle for global leadership. And yet inside both nations, there's a conflict going on for people to figure out what is the world that they want to live in and how is that going to play out? How are we seeing this world? So let's jump into it. I want to talk about the views that we're hearing from, really leaning on two surveys from the Pew Foundation, talking about where they're seeing the world and thoughts on democracy. So what's interesting is most Americans and most people around the world think that the U.S. is no longer the example to follow. And this is a pretty surprising number to see, 72% saying this of Americans and 40% outside the world. And I think it just goes to the conflicts that have come up and arisen. And we'll get into some of the reasons for this and where the priorities are. But I was mentioning to Mark that Gallup came out with a survey around the election. They asked Republicans and Democratic-leaning voters what are their top 5 issues that are extremely important. And between the Republicans and the Democrats, there was zero overlap as to what the top 5 most important items are. For the Republicans, it was the economy, immigration, terrorism, and national security, crime, and taxes. For the Democrats, it was democracy in the U.S., the types of Supreme Court justices, abortion, healthcare, and education. So we can't even agree on the most important things in the U.S. So if that's the starting point, how hard is it to get the rest of it to work? So I thought that's a really kind of telling kind of number. And the other thing that's happened is the people that were our allies, it's changing as to whether we're a good example or not. And that's kind of alarming when you look at these numbers and seeing the drops from Italy, Greece, Spain. Many of these nations, the younger people never thought it was. The older people did think it was. And that's another interesting dynamic of the demographic differences in the views that are being expressed and how that plays out in the voting. And why is this important? We'll get to a little bit later, but clearly this shift of autocratic and democratic, and it goes to what Mark was highlighting before about trade, right? If we start to change and put tariffs on friends, and what does that mean for the world order? If your allies are no longer your friends and your enemies are even bigger enemies, how do you get the world moving forward the right way? But I think this is one of the big issues is we have not set a good example in the U.S. and people are noticing that. I think there's a big issue around the world. And before dropping out, Biden was viewed more favorably than Trump, in most cases, Macron, President Xi, and President Putin. So we have a guy who was basically thrown out by his own party and had more favorability ratings than the guys that are running or potentially going to be running major countries in the world. So it just speaks to how divergent the views are around the world, and also how different it is by region. So what would improve democracy? So this was a survey done in last year. That last survey, three slides were from earlier in June, but this is from last year. And they asked what would improve democracy in your nation. And number one was politicians, changing the leadership, government reform, leadership change, judicial reform, and economic reform are the other issues. Another way to look at it is most mentioned was politicians. Second would have been a mix of government reform and economic reform, followed by legislative changes. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but it speaks to the lack of leadership around the world. And Mark, this is what I was highlighting at your New York event when you asked what scares me. The thing that scares me the most is when you have the problems we have around the world, who's going to lead us away from these problems and how do you move forward? And you compound that with the fact that I just showed you that the top 5 areas that Republicans and Democratic voters can't agree on. And it's not just here. If you go around the world, and this is not a great slide to read, but it basically says that on almost every major issue, most nations are almost divided equally on those big issues, whether it's, paying for parliament members in the UK. One group says we should pay them more. The other guy said we should pay them less and they should pay more attention to the job. Voting in the US, we should make it easier registration and all that. Others are saying go back to the old paper ballots and things. So it is throughout, whether it's religious views, taxation, the treatment of Arabs in Israel, protests in France, immigration issues. We are a divided world when it comes to these issues. And it's that divisiveness makes it very difficult for leaders to move forward because they don't get reelected being honest with the issues. So when they get into it, the top issues get into government reforms, one of the big ones. And around government reform, it's about term limits. It's about adjusting the balance of power between institutions. In some nations, it's who has too much power, who doesn't. In the US, it's really about election reform and term limits and the balance of power. And we're having these fights about redistricting and all that. It's crazy how we're running it. But in other nations, it's other issues as well as to how to get the balance of power right and get it working for the people. I think the second one is economic reform. And this is no surprise, given the fact that since the great financial crisis and the pandemic, we've had massive issues of inequality, about jobs, cost of living. The economic issues of leaving people behind in the haves and have-nots lead to solutions that are highly divisive, whether it's raising taxes or cutting benefits to deal with the economic challenges that we're faced with, how to get this right, how to not leave people behind, a big issue. What's interesting is how citizens behave is a top 5 issue in 3/4 of the nations, and it's in 80% of the nations. It's because we are treating each other internally so poorly that we have to find a better way forward so that we can deal with the issues that are at hand. But if you can't get it right internally, it's hard to get it right externally as well. And then electoral reform is a big one. And that really comes down to free and fair elections without corruption or interference. And in the US case, power transfer transitions that are seamless and not contested is one of the big issues there. So these issues, though, are not just US issues, they're world issues, as you can see. These are top of mind issues for a lot of people. So when you look at it, democracy has people strained and stressed and all that. And you often hear at election times, if so-and-so gets elected, I'm moving to another country. Well, it is interesting that they did a survey and looked at the desire to migrate from, and this is Gallup, from 2011 to 23. And you can see in many cases, it is on the move, although it started to change around 2016 to 2020 when Trump was in, where they started to put restrictions on it in the US. And then you started to see other restrictions coming on from the pandemic, and that started to change people's views of migrating. But clearly, a lot of people view this as their country's direction is not the right one and there are better opportunities elsewhere. And where would they want to go? Well, the U.S. dropped a couple points, and I think that is very much Trump related when he started to say we don't want as many. But now you're starting to see greater restrictions on migration. Canada, which was one of the favored destinations, has cut their immigration numbers, I think, in half to deal with the overflow and the housing issues and some of the other economic issues. In Europe, you have big anti-immigration issues, as you can see with Germany and some of the other areas. Spain was trying to promote immigration and Portugal to get their economy back on track, and that's actually helped their economy move forward. But you can see the diversions and the differences inside. And what does this mean? So when I step back and look at the world and I think about what is a good democracy and what's a bad one? To me, it's in part, it's too simplistic to say they're good and bad. There are so many nuances, but I think where you see people wanting to leave where their homeland is to find better opportunities, that says to me that there is something going on in some of these democratic nations that is driving people to it, because you don't see a lot of autocratic nations as the place that people are rushing to. So I think there's a lot going on here that democracy is under change. I think we're going to end up in a hybrid model where the world is moving towards after we get some more divisiveness from the geopolitical issues. I think we end up where the US and China are going to need to find a way to work together better and bring the world back together again. I think that has to be the outcome to make the economies work going forward and not blow the whole place up, because the problems that internally most nations are facing with debt and deficits and low growth are going to require more of a global solution, similar to when everyone came together in the great financial crisis, because I think we're sitting on 300 trillion of debt and rising. We have slow growth coming. We have massive needs inside our nations to deal with it, whether it's jobs around the world, whether it's cost of living issues. And then it's how do we get the trade right again? Because, Mark, I think you're right. One of the biggest issues of the last several years is the breakdown of globalization. And what does that mean? It means higher cost, it means higher cost of living and higher cost of doing business, which the policies we're putting out, I think, are augmenting that, not addressing it. So I think we're going to have to come back together. So when I look at the world right now, the big risks still are the great conflicts that exist around the world. But the big one is, to me, the US and China, because I think we're the ones that can drive solutions towards the Middle East and towards Europe if we get our collective acts together and lead appropriately. I think the debt and deficits in the US have a big impact on the entire world, and how we get our policies right for interest rates have big impact on currencies and trade around the world. So I think that is a big part of it. And a lot of writing on this election around the policies that are being proposed by both candidates. I think a lot of what is going to come down to is, do we have a divided government or not? Because that'll limit what either Trump or Harris could get through. I think the other issue of acts of nature are creating massive costs, whether it's what you're seeing in the flooding in Asia, what you're seeing in the fires in the West, hurricanes, earthquakes, and the like. It's changing industries dramatically. We talked about changing terms of trade, but I think the big issue is the limited fiscal space for governments to deal with these problems is just not there. So I think that's going to mean we're going to have to make smarter, better investment decisions and can't solve all the problems that people want, which is a problem for elected leaders. I think where capital is going to flow is still around the big themes of the reindustrialization that's going on, the electrification of the economy, the digitalization that are connected around AI and powering it up, conflicts debt, and then what are the monetary and fiscal responses, and how do we deal with this? We had a much better situation going into the great financial crisis where countries were in a better spot to deal with future crises. We're in a terrible spot right now to deal with the next crisis around the world. I think we're going to continue to invest in the areas that everyone loves of energy, industrials, materials, energy, I think selected financials, because of the rates, are going to be higher than longer than most people expect. I think healthcare is the biggest beneficiary of what's going on. I think the BRICS getting a bigger seat at the table, and how do we deal with that in the West, and how do we get a better balance between the BRIC nations and the advanced nations, and how do we bring them together, I think is the key issue. But I think when you have a low growth, rising debt world, you're going to have bigger winners and losers, and that's going to create greater strains before we get to the solutions. And I think in those times, the U.S. Continues to attract capital. And even what's interesting is we're attracting capital. We have rising markets, even with rising interest rates, and the dollar strengthening. So I think this is a really interesting time for investors. And I'll leave you with one last thought on democracy. I think this quote is right. I think we're absent morally grounded leadership right now. So I think this speaks to the problem of resolving democracies around the world, because we have the divisiveness and we're lacking good leadership to get us where we need to get to. Sets us up for a challenging period. That said, I think the markets continue to not run up into the year end. I think we have some volatility. But I think we're setting up in the U.S. markets for a pretty healthy run into next year. I don't believe either candidates will get all the stuff they want. So where you're concerned about the 100% tariffs and things like that, Trump can do the tariffs on China. He can threaten other tariffs, but to go across the board, his 10% tariff increases would likely be contested and require congressional approval. And I believe that given the debt and deficit levels right now, you will find after the election, if Trump won, he would not have as much support as he thinks, because Republicans in the House and Senate will be focused, who are up for elections in the midterms, will already be focused on the midterm elections. So what he can do in the first year will be limited. And I think it'll be more from a tariff perspective, if he gets in, would be more a negotiating play rather than a straight across the board, just throw them on. I think if Harris gets in, it depends on whether she has the ability to get the Senate so that she can get her policies in place. I think it'll be very tough for her to get all the tax increases that she wants to do as well. So I don't think we're going to and fund all the programs she wants. So I don't think the deficits will blow up as much as everyone fears or has been projected, because I don't think they'll get through, because I think we're going to be into moving to midterms much faster than people think after the election. I do think it'll be sloppy here for a bit of time, particularly if Trump loses. So, Mark, I'll stop there and open up for comments and discussion.
So, yeah, I usually open up to everybody immediately. I just want to say two things. We'll be somewhat smarter on Thursday, and we have another debrief, but not at 8 a.m. It's at 12 p.m. It's actually right here at ARS's offices with 10 lawyers, 10 tax lawyers, giving us their views of the scenarios from firms you'll recognize, maybe a few you don't. And the second thing, we were having a pre-call. We were going to talk today about China and Iran, but we decided not to. But the question was posed in the pre-call with some people was, how important is the U.S. and Europe to China? And the thought was, is it more important than some of its allies, like Russia and Iran? And the consensus was, we are more important to them. We're more important to each other. So why cannot there be an enlightened détente? So with that, I'll open it up. What do people have? Thoughts, questions on what?
I'll add one thing to that, Mark. The troops on the ground in Russia is very different than if they cross the border into Ukraine. Because if they do that, that violates one of the Chinese 5 principles of whatever their foreign policy is, of not getting involved in other people's battles. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a really interesting nuance to where the troops are. But if you start seeing North Koreans ending up in Ukraine, I think that is a different element of it as well. Something to just keep an eye on.
Gotcha. Well, thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I still think that for China, the US and Europe is still more important than their current allies. The relationship between China and Russia isn't all that warm and hunky-dory anyway. And with the recent development of the North Koreans sending their troops to Russia, it shows that China and North Korea, their relationship are now cooling to a certain extent. And I believe somehow China is toning that down in terms of their relationship with Russia and North Korea, so that China will not lose Europe and US.
It's a very interesting kabuki dance that's going on right now to try and figure out who your friends are and who your friends aren't. The US is having a similar experience with Israel right now as to how far do we go in support. So I think, our partners create problems for us. And I think China's finding that with their partners, and the US is finding it with some of ours.
Yeah, I still think that Israel started a war so that Trump could win. It has nothing to do with whether the support from US is anything. I think US, no matter what, will always support Israel. That's my thinking.
Okay, others?
But I do not represent Singapore, by the way. Okay. Singapore remains friendly to all nations. We have been pretty promiscuous in all our relationship with all other nations. So
Just
Fair enough.
right after that comments, you will see our PM, Singapore PM. Interestingly, just after knowing that the chance or likelihood that Trump gonna win, so what he did immediately is he sent the senior officers. Then he himself went to China, and then started to talking all the good words that re-emphasizing the partnership between Singapore and China. So I think that's a very interesting observation. Before, probably this batting on Harris will be like waning after it replaced the Bidens, but now looks like everyone's started to planning if after the election, if Trump has come back into power, what are we gonna do next for our own nation? How do we deal with these big powers?
I think the US and China are struggling because they expected people to line up behind them instead of lining up in the middle of them and playing both sides, which
Correct.
is the smart thing to do. India's done it quite well lately. I think a lot of nations are going to choose both, not one or the other. And I think both the US and China are going to have to reorient their policy towards that type of a model where you don't control a country, you partner with them, and China's going to be in there as well. It's going to be very interesting because I don't think we have the ability to push everyone around like we used to in both nations.
Others? Daniel or Istiak?
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. It was extremely interesting to listen to it, but I'm listening. It's very interesting to listen. Thank you.
Would you guys do anything different based on the election for your investment portfolios?
I can share mine. So I think post-COVID, a lot of changes are happening, right? And there are too much uncertainties going around. So what I've done is I've planted initiatives, projects in different parts, in all the continents actually, except for Arctic and Antarctic. Okay, so all the continents, I actually have projects going on right now, and that's to spread and to diversify or to reduce my geographical concentration risk.
Mhm.
Okay, that's how I'm dealing with it right now. So even if, let's say, BRICS, they come together and they say they're going to come up with a certain currency against USD and things like that, I have exposure to other BRICS nations, so I'm not that worried. That's how I'm playing the game right now. Is looking at the entire portfolio from a geographical spread perspective, and then sectoral.
Mhm.
If you own the miners, you may have exposure to the Arctica and Antarctica as well. Because that's where
I
they're
don't
going
think
for
I
the
can-
rare earths next.
I don't think I will want to go there and do due diligence.
You got people doing it for you, though. That's the next hunt for rare earths.
Well, space,
Yep.
the next frontier.
That's another one.
Yeah, for me, what I'm seeing is, for the past 2 years, so I'm in this startup world, and then understand early stage, medium stage investments a lot. But for the past 2 years, it's terrible for VCP funds, and then because the IPO rule just shrinked, in some extent, is just VC are struggling, and so startups are struggling. But hopefully, after these elections, that have a clear answer, no matter who is coming back, and then once people that confidence is coming back because they know that at least the next 4 years what are going to happen, then we'll start to see this this market started to rebuild the confidence, and then the money is flowing. So some of this portfolio started to be having these opportunities either for acquisition, for merger, for buyout, and we're gonna start to have that money being able to be redeployed to somewhere else. So that's probably one of our strategies that I'm looking for. That'll be probably more active if we see that trends.
I think you touched on one of the really interesting issues that I think there's the reality of where yields end up on the long end, and do they get as low as everyone thinks? I think gets to the issue you were just raising, which is there is hope in the small cap and startup world that lower rates will move things up again. But I wonder or when are rates going to drop as much as everyone thinks? We've been of the camp that they're not, and Mark knows for a long time, we've been thinking the economy is much stronger than people think in the US, and therefore the Fed's not going to cut rates as much as the market would like. I think one of the things that you're starting to see the FANGs since the rate cut, the FANGs have done well and small caps haven't, and yields have moved up 50 basis points. I think there should be some concern in the venture and small cap world that we're not going to see rates come down enough. And that means that those companies in the small cap world in the public markets that are carrying high debt loads, or the ones that are trying to raise money with high cost of capital, are going to really have a harder time getting the returns that they might have gotten in the past. So I think that may be a little bit tougher lower return expectations for them and make the hold periods longer and further reduce returns. So I think that's an area that we need to keep a close eye on, because I'm not sure rates are going to drop to the hopes that investors have to get the returns they're looking for.
Makes sense. Totally.
Hi, Streeter, we're just wrapping up.
All right,
But
sorry.
I know this is one of them. I was telling everybody there's these people that have dinner at this time. So Streeter,
I'm sorry, I was in a way. I thought, there's something, at the end of the day, but I'm sorry. I apologize. I
well,
missed the session.
there is at 11 o'clock. We always have the 11 o'clock briefing. That'll be
Right.
much more people, but we thought we would try this. But I'm not giving up on it. And I'm not going to go to 6 a.m. either. I would lose Steven if I did.
Mark, we do have one other thing I want to mention. Next Tuesday night at 4 p.m. We're going to have a Zoom with Miles Nadal, who's a majority owner of our firm and a entrepreneur out of Canada, and Frank Luntz, the pollster. And Frank is going to give his take on the election now that we've had a week from the time the votes were started to get a better sense of where the world is going to be. And if you haven't heard Frank lately, he is there's no mute button on him, and
Hi,
there's no
everyone.
regulation on that. So you'll get the unvarnished view of how they messed up, whoever messed up, and what he thinks the outcome's what happens now. So I think that'll be an interesting call. We'll do a replay of it and send that around for those who are dialing in from Asia. So.
Yeah, I think the overarching theme is it's going to be a very fascinating election relative to 2020. Lots have changed in the kind of the political stratosphere across, the various battleground states. It's going to be interesting to see, how the dynamics play out, especially in 4 or 5 states which have played a marginal role but strategic role in changing the landscape of elections, both in 2016 and 2020. I don't know how the pollsters are going to, it'll be interesting to listen to the pollsters who more often than not tend to be wrong rather than right, especially not factoring in some of the on-ground changes.
Yeah, and Trump makes it very difficult because he's so erratic that people either gravitate to it or hate it, and you just never know. And people won't say if they're going to vote for him if they are going to vote for him because they don't want to be viewed as a nut. So it's a funny dynamic. That's part of the reason the polls have been so wrong. Is you're embarrassed some people are embarrassed to say they're voting for him. Others are unabashed. So it makes a very difficult polling
Got it.
element.
No, I think that is fascinating. It's very interesting that
Just
you have
sort of
Mark
continue
Cuban.
on. I'm going to let you.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you continue on. I'm going to be in a breakout room. You carry on.
So it's going to be fascinating from an economic context. I mean, the debate was around Mark Cuban presenting his view as to why he thinks Kamala Harris policies will be distinctly different in terms of the budget as well as the fiscal policies relative to Biden. So obviously, things have changed. It'll be interesting to see how that flows out in the eventuality, if particularly on the corporate tax rates and the individual tax rates. He seems to think Harris is much more favorable relative to what Biden had in mind.
Which would be interesting because what she said is not more favorable; it's much more negative. And I think it's not tax policy to get the deficit down; it's tax policy to spend more, and that's not. I think that's going to be a challenge for the markets. For the bond vigilantes are out already, right? You've seen that with rates up 60 basis points off the recent lows. And I think one of the things that people are underestimating right now is will either candidate, regardless of how much support they get, be able to get through their policies, because I think we'll be worried about midterms faster than people think. And I do think that in the Republican Party, I think there will be enough people that will care about the deficit that they'll make it hard for Trump to do all the stuff he wants to do. I also think that our corporate tax rates are appropriate right now. They're not. I don't think Trump should lower them, and I don't think Harris should raise them. They're in line with the OECD average. So it's not a good policy to do either one. I don't believe Trump would get any of his major tax cuts through. Going to 18 or 21% or whatever he's talking about getting to, I don't think he's going to get that stuff through either.
No.
So I'm not sure that the fears that everyone has on this election are not overblown economically.
Yeah. I just don't think that they could do anything on the deficit side. I don't think either party has a policy framework for reducing the deficit. In fact, they're going to add to the deficit rather than reduce the deficit. I was part of the, the Steve Mnuchin team. I worked with 3 treasurers, including Jack Lew, who was my former boss at Citibank. They're very drastically different views, but fortunately, the interest rate regime at that point of time helped us to rebalance the deficit and bring down the interest payments. But now that's a runaway wreck at the moment. There's no way they're going to be able to do anything about it. Just accept it as part of the balance sheet.
It is interesting. I think Niall Ferguson's raised this issue multiple times, which is no country can remain a world-leading power if your net debt servicing costs continue to remain higher than your defense spending costs, and we're in that mode right now. But I do think there are elements of Washington that are waking up to it, and I'm very negative on Washington, D.C. overall, so I'm not a supporter of either party. I think they're both morally bankrupt. So just to be cards on the table, I don't favor either one of them. I'm against all of them. But I do think there are elements there that will really get back to why they were there, because they are worried about the deficits, not the candidates at all. Both Trump and Harris policies around the deficits, if they were put through, would be ruinous for the debt and the deficits. I don't think they're going to get all their stuff through. I'm fully on board for divided government right now. That's my vote, is for divided government. Slow them down from the wasteful spending. I don't think Musk can take $2 trillion off our spending either. As easy as that is to say, it's not practical, as you know.
I think the fixed cost now on the expense side of the balance sheet has blown up so much. There's no question of revenue offset, and there's no mechanism in terms of cutting the expenses. There's no what we call the mandatory expenses. There's no way they can. They're not going to cut deficit. They're not going to cut healthcare. They're not going to cut Social Security. There's no mechanism to cut the interest cost that's sitting there between the 4 of them. We are talking of north of $3.5 to $4 trillion in terms of the total spend. Yeah. We are not even close to the revenues, receipts.
No, I think we do about 3.2, 3.4 in revenues right now, and and him cutting taxes, and you're not going to make it up in tariffs. That's one of the dumber policies that has ever been put forth. But we keep coming up with dumber policies all the time, so I'm not sure what the next one's going to be. But that one won't work. I don't believe so. Yeah, it's a bit of a scary time from that perspective. But I look back at our history in the U.S., and we've had a lot of boobs running the country. And we've still moved forward, and the markets continue to move up, and innovation's a big part of it. But I think right now we have taken things for granted, and the next president and Congress can't, because I think you're right. The twin problems that we have of debt and deficits are not going to be resolved by either of the policies put out there.
I think that if I was sitting in a bank and running this balance sheet, I would be kind of looking at and saying, not around the debt, to see first, how do I come up with a plan which is outside the receipts, to see how I can, put money into the balance sheet, either through sale of assets or some innovative pricing, to service that debt cost and keep the debt cost like off balance sheet item and deal with it in a different manner. But of course, our budget office doesn't work that way. So therefore, it's going to sit there, and it's going to hurt any kind of economic kind of program and any kind of catastrophe that is confronting us. We got 3 wars going on at the same time, and there's no way that we can fund any of the wars.
Nope. And we need to completely revamp our military spend anyway, because we're designed for old wars, not the new ones, as well. So it is problematic from that perspective. we've always had the view that the U.S. government should split their spend between maintenance spend, OPEX, and CAPEX, and run it the way you would run a business. But the government doesn't do that. They just
No.
have one pool of money. But that's
Yeah.
how you solve this problem: is
Right.
you invest investable dollars with return on investment targets and evaluate off of that, and you triage to the most important issues. Right now, we spend on everything without prioritization. So.
No. Two single buckets, receipts and expenses. They define and allocate. And there's no question of cutback. Everything that is allocated is spent and it's waste, and it goes in. So in for some very troubled times, unless there is a dramatic cut in the lending rates, the prime rates, by at least 200 basis points, there's no way the interest costs on the debt is going to come down, Steve.
And if you do that, you'll create a financial crisis. You will, right? How do you not have a financial crisis with the debt deficit levels that we have around the world, and
Right.
cut rates and fuel with the cash that's on the sideline? Should have a market melt up, and you could have an explosion of inequality that will take off even greater, create more social divisiveness, and I think you would end up with massive financial crises between the dollar debts that would be blowing up through that. So I agree with you. That's what's needed. I'm not sure we want that solution.
No. But the amazing truth, which when you go back 20, 30 years, today, 30 to 40% of the market cap is located in assets which doesn't flow through into the main economic stream. They're more into the corporate stream rather than into the economic stream. These are the $2 trillion companies and $2.5 or $3 trillion companies. So you have asymmetric meltdown or asymmetric market valuation and market disruption, which actually dislocates the main components or the main drivers of the economy, and which is why, as you rightly point out, that we could have a financial crisis, whichever way you kind of jig the balance sheet, and the consequences that you face either on the receipts and the expense side of the balance sheet or on the market cap, that will dislocate the savings of the average investor.
The other thing is we haven't had a normal economic cycle in 15 to 30 years, right? I mean,
Right.
we've since the financial crisis, we have not allowed the economy to deal with the excesses the way they need to. And we've supported populations with fiscal spend that now has the giveaways to be so big that you can't reverse that either. So I think we got to get through those excesses. And I wouldn't want to be a leader of any of these countries right now, because all of them are getting, whoever wins the election in the United States is going to be dealt with a pretty bad deck of cards.
Yep.
So I
It's a
think
no-win
that,
situation.
yeah.
It's a no-win situation.
Yep. And I think that's I think that realization, once they're in, is also going to drive the policies from their platforms to the reality of what their economic policies will be. Because as you just highlighted, the problems are massive and we don't have enough money to deal with all of them. So the giveaways that both candidates in the US would want to do will be very hard to get through because we don't have the money for them.
No. One of the things that concerns me, let's kind of leave the Republican side. On the Harris side, is that she's never managed anything as a leader, which is a very, very big question mark. And most of the people whom she has got now assembled, it's almost like Biden. It's like Obama 4. The continuation from 1, 2, 3, and 4. I don't know who the Treasury Secretary is going to be and who the economic managers are going to be. I mean, she's not done anything during her vice presidency to demonstrate leadership in any of those areas. Then you have a foreign policy and trade issue that she has to kind of deal with in a present geopolitical world. So that's what at least people know, that Trump is a maverick and unpredictable, and they've dealt with him, but they've not dealt with Kamala Harris as either as a vice president or as a leader around the world. This is another big uncertainty, Steve.
I agree. I think it's interesting. I think if I was a foreign leader, I'd rather have Harris than Trump, because Harris, you can come up with a playbook for. Trump is more difficult to have a playbook for to counter because of his unpredictability. But I'll say there's something else that people really need to start focusing on is the giveaways that we've done over the last decade have lowered productivity. And we need to be raising productivity, and we have gone the opposite way. And now we have an opportunity with AI to really change the productive nature of the economy, but we have to capture that. And you can't do that if you keep giving away on the other side. At some point, you have to stop it from. It has to go from one side of the balance sheet to the other. It just can't stay with one side of the balance sheet expanding, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's the problem. And if we don't get the productivity improvements, you can't get out of this problem. And you can't keep giving money away and expecting the system becomes more productive, becomes less when you make capital too easy. And I think that's really the issue. And I think that's going to keep rates a little bit higher than people are expecting and force better decisions on all levels, companies and governments. And as us as investors in the private space, I don't think we're going to get the gift we've got of the last 20 years ever again. And if we do get it, you don't want it. Because you won't be positioned for it when it comes, because we'll have wanted to be in all cash.
Exactly. Better to be long cash and small on returns rather than the other way. So
exactly. But I think that's one of the concerns in the public markets, in small cap, and in the private markets. You have to be really careful about your companies not having enough growth and having too much debt. And that is the story of the small cap world right now. It's more have-nots and a couple haves with bad debt problems and rising interest costs and low growth. Not the scenario you're going to be throwing money to. And if that stays, and if the rates stay higher and your returns take longer to realize in the private area, and you're waiting 5 years was what everyone was hoping for, and now it's 10 or 12, your return numbers come way down quickly, and then was it worth the wait, right?
Private markets are gone, Steve. Private markets are way out of kilter in terms of correlation to the public markets. So they're nowhere in the picture. So there's significant erosion of capital in the private markets. Public markets have performed purely because on the back of the tech sector. My former institution, JP Morgan, says 80% equity, 20% fixed income cash is the norm. That's okay if the large cap continues to perform around specific segments. But as you pointed out, the small cap, mid cap, which has been the engine of the economy for the past 40 years, that's just going to be sabotaged with rates and imbalances in their ability to fund and grow the business.
It's the single biggest employer in the U.S. too.
Yeah, it is.
And the challenge is we have to support them better. And I think I would say Harris's tax policies would be ruinous for small business.
Absolutely.
And I can't believe there's not more outrage about that, because they get hit both on the personal and on the corporate tax increase.
On the corporate side. The SME is badly affected.
Yep.
Great. Nice. So we'll reconnect.
Sounds good.